History calls Napoleon a genius, but maybe the truth is he just fought the dumbest lineup of commanders in history. One Austrian general managed to surrender 27,000 men before a single shot was fired. A French marshal literally marched in the opposite direction of cannon fire, as if noise-canceling stupidity was a battle tactic. And one king switched sides so many times he made Europe look like a bad reality show, then got himself executed in a peacock costume. These weren't just blunders, they were catastrophes so stupid they made Napoleon look like a god. Today, we're counting down the biggest idiots of the Napoleonic Wars. Proof that sometimes history isn't shaped by genius, but by absolute clowns. Apologies to clowns. Before disaster tarnished his image forever, Austrian General Karl Mack von Leiberich had been a favorite of Emperor Francis II, who had personally entrusted him with reorganizing the imperial army. But the arrogant and overconfident Mack, who believed that rigid plans could substitute for flexibility in battle, was in no way suited to lead a field army against Napoleon. He was, according to later Austrian critics, a man more accustomed to writing memoranda in staff rooms than to commanding in the field. In the year 1805, while commanding the Austrian forces of the Third Coalition, Mack received reports that Napoleon was advancing with frightening speed across southern Germany. In response, the pompous general marched his army to the city of Ulm on the Danube, convinced that he could hold the French emperor at bay until Russian reinforcements arrived. Believing the French maneuvers were just bluffs, Mack did not prepare his men for a full encirclement and even dispersed his forces in small detachments, as if the enemy could be checked piecemeal. What Mack didn't realize was that he was cluelessly sitting in the middle of Napoleon's great flanking maneuver, one of the boldest of the entire campaign. While the Austrians lingered along the Danube, the French army crossed the Rhine, swept north of Mack's position, and then wheeled around to trap him from behind. Napoleon knew that a self-confident planner such as Mack would stubbornly cling to his fortress. That made him the perfect victim of the trap that had been engineered. But then, Austrian scouts and subordinates brought intelligence that threatened to upset Napoleon's design. Several officers urged Mack to break out quickly to the east before the jaws snapped shut, warning him that the French were surrounding them. But Mack, dismissing their fears as exaggerations, brushed it off and insisted that his orders be obeyed to the letter. Accompanied by staff who dared not contradict him, he remained in Ulm with some 27,000 troops, while Napoleon's marshals closed every road around the city. Suddenly, it got real. By mid-October, French corps had sealed all the exits, and Austrian columns attempting to break through were repulsed. At the same time, heavy autumn rains turned the roads into mud and strained the already weak supply system. Then the French tightened the noose, cutting off communications and bombarding any Austrian attempt to resist. The Austrians managed to hold for a few days, but as the situation worsened, morale collapsed and desertions mounted. Knowing the game was up, Mack sent envoys to negotiate terms with Napoleon. On October 20, 1805, he formally surrendered the city of Ulm and 27,000 soldiers without a major battle, handing the French one of their most bloodless and complete victories. He claimed that illness had left him unable to continue command, but this excuse convinced no one. The consequences were catastrophic. Austria was effectively knocked out of the war before the main coalition battle had ever been fought. Napoleon marched eastward unopposed and crushed the combined Russian and Austrian armies at Austerlitz 6 weeks later, sealing one of his most famous triumphs. Mack himself? Well, he was court-martialed by his own government, he was stripped of rank and sentenced to imprisonment, though he was later pardoned and even re-employed, only to blunder again in subsequent postings. Mack proved more than any other Austrian commander that you can lose a war before it even starts if your ego outpaces your brain. We've seen them all, and we've all resented them. Since the beginning of recorded time, the inflexible and prideful men who mistake stubbornness for strength have been given armies they are simply not capable of leading. In modern terminology, we might refer to this special breed of blowhards as bosses who still use fax machines, which brings us to General Gregorio Garcia de la Cuesta. The Spanish officer who would become infamous during the Peninsular War was no child of noble birth, but his long years of service and his sheer unwillingness to compromise earned him high commands he was in no way suited to. Naturally, he believed himself the defender of Spain's honor, but there was just one problem. Cuesta was a talentless, rigid commander. Using his seniority and reputation for patriotism, he was appointed to lead Spanish armies against Napoleon's forces after the uprising of 1808. Spain entered the conflict with manpower and determination, but with an army that had been starved of reform for decades. Now, to put that into perspective, while France's troops were hardened by years of campaigning, Spain's generals were clinging to outdated tactics that belonged in the previous century. So what did Gregorio Garcia de la Cuesta do with his command? He marched boldly against the French with little coordination, and time after time his armies were destroyed. At Medina del Rio Seco in July 1808, his rash decision to attack without proper support cost him thousands of men in a single day. And he was not done yet. At Medellin in March 1809, he repeated the same mistakes, and again his soldiers paid the price. Yeah, you heard that right. 2 major defeats in less than a year, and both could have been avoided. You see, Cuesta's policy was to stand firm and to attack head-on, even when there was very little chance of winning. And there was very little chance of winning because he refused to coordinate with Britain's commanders, especially Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. One of Spain's main wartime objectives was to resist French domination through a combined alliance, but in his infinite wisdom, this Spanish imbecile treated his allies with contempt. Not only did he reject sound advice, but he also wasted the advantages he did have through poor deployment. His xenophobia and his pride were as dangerous to his men as any French cannon. Oh yeah, and when the moment came to retreat, he almost never gave the order until it was too late. Some say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But this could easily apply to stupidity as well. Hemmed in by his own arrogance, in essence, Gregorio Garcia de la Cuesta launched one hopeless venture after another. Only rarely did his stubborn stance delay the enemy, and when he inevitably failed, this Spanish ignoramus blamed everyone but himself. Believing that willpower alone could substitute for strategy, he accused subordinates of disloyalty and clung to the idea that discipline was all that mattered. His inability to adapt made him the bane of his allies and a disaster for his own troops. The irony, though, was that Cuesta himself was no model of courage. After being routed at Medellin, he was nearly trampled in the chaos and was physically injured, carried from the field while his army dissolved. At Talavera in July 1809, where he briefly cooperated with Wellesley, he refused to yield authority or retreat when necessary, risking the annihilation of both armies. His failures were so spectacular that Spanish juntas and British commanders alike pressed for his removal. Finally, in late 1809, the arrogant, cruel, and incompetent Gregorio Garcia de la Cuesta was relieved of command, much to the relief of everyone. Cuesta turned alliances into alibis and victories into vapor. For our next dummy, let's turn to Jean-Andoche Junot, the French marshal who fought more with his pipe than with his plans. In the autumn of 1807, Napoleon dispatched him at the head of an army bound for Portugal, its mission to occupy Lisbon and secure the coastline against Britain. Stopping off in Spain first, his ultimate destination was the Tagus estuary. Once in Lisbon, he was supposed to impose French control and force the Portuguese monarchy into compliance with the continental system. Of course, being Napoleon's trusted aide, he had a formidable reputation behind him. Serving as one of the emperor's loyal companions since the Italian campaigns, Junot had risen swiftly. But reputation is not the same as ability, and though he looked the part in uniform, he was plagued by crippling dependence on opium and alcohol. Since the campaign involved long marches through Spain's rough terrain, the French columns had to move with discipline and speed to avoid British interference, and Junot's army entered Portugal exhausted and half-starved. While en route, Junot, who was by now increasingly erratic in command, pressed his men into forced marches of up to 30 miles a day. Soldiers dropped out by the hundreds, and horses collapsed on the rocky roads. In fact, conditions were so severe that when his army finally staggered into Lisbon, it was in no state to defend the capital. The Portuguese royal family had already fled overseas to Brazil under British protection. This meant that the occupation, which should have been a triumph, instead looked more like a blunder carried out at great human cost. The first weeks of French control passed with little opposition. Everything looked like it was going to stabilize without a hitch, and then Junot's weaknesses entered the scene. He had been entrusted with holding Portugal, yet he failed to secure supply lines and alienated the population with harsh requisitions. You can imagine the horror on his face when a popular uprising broke out, joined quickly by British troops under Arthur Wellesley. Junot had forgotten that occupation required more than just arriving in the capital. It demanded strategy, allies, and planning. Panic swept through French headquarters. They only had limited time to reorganize their exhausted army before Wellesley struck at Vimeiro in August 1808. At first, Junot attempted to maneuver his divisions, but he misread the terrain and deployed his troops poorly. Then he compounded the error by launching repeated frontal assaults against well-positioned British lines. By this point, enough valuable lives had been wasted, and when his reserves failed to arrive in time, the French were driven back with heavy losses. Napoleon remained remarkably calm when he heard the news, but his trust in Junot had already started to fade. In contrast, the French officers under Junot were far less forgiving. Many of them complained about his confused orders and erratic behavior. It was said, though we cannot prove it with certainty, that his reliance on opium made him unreliable in the field, sometimes leaving him dazed or incoherent during critical decisions. Meanwhile, his men, battered and demoralized, had to negotiate an evacuation under the Convention of Sintra, a humiliating treaty that allowed them to sail home rather than face annihilation. By the time Napoleon received the official reports, it was actually too late for Junot to salvage his reputation. He was recalled to France, still technically favored but now viewed as unreliable. Later in 1812, he was again given command during the invasion of Russia, but once more, his delays and indecision at Smolensk weakened French efforts. In the aftermath, Junot's mental health collapsed, and by 1813 he was removed from service. Eventually, in a tragic end, he took his own life after falling into a complete mental breakdown. Junot showed, more than any other of Napoleon's marshals, that loyalty is no substitute for lucidity, especially when you're high on hubris. As we've seen, there are a lot of contenders for history's biggest idiots, but our next one rides ahead of the pack in peacock feathers. Joachim Murat was the son of an innkeeper from southwestern France, but through dazzling horsemanship and shameless ambition, he vaulted into Napoleon's inner circle. During the Revolutionary Wars, he caught the emperor's eye, and by the early 1800s, he was not only a marshal of France, but also married to Caroline Bonaparte, Napoleon's sister. By the time of his greatest follies, he styled himself King of Naples, with a wardrobe so extravagant that he looked like a costume ball come to life. When Murat assumed the Neapolitan throne in 1808, he tried his best to imitate his brother-in-law. At the time of his accession, Naples was a client kingdom that depended on French support, which meant he had to balance his loyalties between Napoleon and the shifting coalitions of Europe. Furthermore, Murat was brave to the point of recklessness but had little understanding of grand strategy. Wanting to establish himself as more than Napoleon's flamboyant sidekick, he struck out with independent command, and each time, he blundered. Obviously, his first test came in the German campaigns of 1813, where Napoleon needed him to hold Saxony against the Allies. Instead, Murat squandered cavalry charges and failed to consolidate French positions, allowing the coalition to regain momentum after Leipzig. In response, he declared loyalty to Napoleon, then secretly negotiated with Austria to save his crown in Italy. The thing is, though, by switching sides clumsily, he earned the distrust of both camps. When Napoleon escaped Elba in 1815, Murat, who still fancied himself the great cavalry king, made the unbelievably foolish decision to rejoin the fight on his own terms. Then, to make matters even worse, his gamble to rally Italy against Austria collapsed almost immediately. Through a combination of vanity, betrayal, and sheer stupidity, Joachim Murat had committed himself into a fight he could not win. In May 1815, he launched the so-called Neapolitan War against Austria, hoping to ignite Italian nationalism. Within a month, he had already lost Tolentino, his army scattered, and his dream of an Italian throne reduced to smoke. In other words, within a month, Murat had already destroyed the kingdom he was trying to preserve. Because he had no other choice but to flee, his defeat at Tolentino set the tone for the last months of his life. Against all political logic, he believed he could reclaim power with a bold return. And, in October 1815, he landed in Calabria with a pitiful force of supporters. Over the course of a single day, he was captured, tried by the Austrians, and sentenced to death. By October 13, 1815, Murat was standing before a Neapolitan firing squad, dressed in one of his elaborate uniforms. He was like the Leiberich of marshals. Increasingly desperate but still vain, he refused a blindfold and ordered the soldiers to aim at his heart. His final attempt at bravado could not disguise the truth that he had failed as both a king and a commander. This leads us to a fact that defies belief. Despite commanding some of the most spectacular cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars, Murat's strategic record was a string of disasters. He betrayed Napoleon, lost his kingdom, and was executed within months of his final gamble. This makes him one of the most ridiculous cautionary tales of the era, and all because one flamboyant marshal thought he could turn style into strategy. What do you think of when you hear the name Waterloo? If this very utterance makes you imagine muddy fields, exhausted men, and the end of an empire, then you're pretty close to the truth. Over the course of just one day in June 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte's last gamble collapsed as British, Dutch, and Prussian forces combined to bring him down for good. His defeat at Waterloo has become shorthand for final ruin, but he wasn't just an ambitious conqueror. It might be hard to believe, but Napoleon still had a chance of winning on that field, if only his marshals had shown more initiative. And when he wasn't relying on blind obedience, he was counting on men who could read the room and act accordingly. With this in mind, this makes the actions of Emmanuel de Grouchy all the more puzzling. This otherwise solid cavalry officer was elevated to marshal only in April 1815 during Napoleon's 100 Days. 2 months later, he was entrusted with a mission that would determine the fate of France. After the French victory at Ligny on June 16th, Napoleon sent Grouchy with about 33,000 men to pursue the retreating Prussians. The task was simple enough: keep them from reuniting with the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army. Napoleon was absolutely clear, but being the rigid soldier he was, Grouchy followed his orders to the letter without considering the wider picture. His terms were not unreasonable. All he had to do was shadow the Prussians and prevent them from turning back. It was at this point that Grouchy made a decision of monumental stupidity. On June 18th, while Napoleon was fighting for his life at Waterloo, Grouchy heard the distant roar of cannon from the battlefield. Instead of marching to the sound, he continued plodding away after the retreating Prussians, convinced that his emperor's instructions bound him to that course. The old saying goes that pride comes before a fall, and in this case it was the fall of an entire empire. What followed was a decisive collapse of Napoleon's army as the Prussians under Blücher arrived on Wellington's flank late in the afternoon. Now, to give a sense of scale, nearly 50,000 Prussians entered the field, tipping the balance against the French. When Grouchy finally realized what had happened, well, it was too late. His forces, isolated and marching in the wrong direction, played no part in the battle that ended Europe's fate. In the end, and luckily for him, Grouchy escaped the carnage. He managed to retreat with his corps intact, avoiding the annihilation that consumed the rest of Napoleon's army. But in total, his boneheaded obedience helped ensure the emperor's final downfall. Napoleon himself supposedly remarked afterward that Grouchy had been as good as 30,000 men less. Later, Grouchy was condemned by Bonapartists as the man who had lost Waterloo, even if modern historians argue that Napoleon's defeat was probably inevitable by that stage. Grouchy turned follow orders into follow failure and caused France its emperor. The leaders of Spain's armies in the early 19th century were not scions of brilliant reformers or heirs to a modern military tradition. They were, instead, the product of a decayed system riddled with favoritism, corruption, and stale thinking. Generals like Francisco Javier Castaños, Joaquin Blake, and others were promoted less for merit than for loyalty to absolutism. Naturally, they inherited command at a time when Spain was facing Napoleon's battle-hardened legions, but there was just one problem. They were a bunch of outdated and incompetent officers. Using their political connections to the juntas that had sprung up after the French invasion in 1808, they were entrusted with large formations of troops. Spain's armies, at least on paper, were formidable, numbering in the hundreds of thousands across the peninsula. To put that into perspective, Spain fielded more soldiers in total than Britain had sent under Wellington in those same years. So what did these commanders do with such numbers? Well, they squandered them in a series of catastrophic battles. At Ocaña in 1809, more than 50,000 Spaniards were routed by half as many French, while at Albuera in 1811, their disorganized charges nearly undid a hard-fought Allied stand. You heard that right. With advantages in manpower, they still managed to fail, and failed miserably. You see, the Spanish general's policy was to cling to rigid line tactics even when there was very little chance of success. And there was very little chance of success because they refused to adapt to the modern methods of combined arms that Napoleon marshals mastered. One of Spain's main wartime objectives was to expel the French from the peninsula with Allied help. But in their infinite wisdom, these Spanish imbeciles often resisted cooperation. They distrusted British commanders like Wellington, treated Portuguese allies with disdain, and pursued doomed offensives without coordination. Oh yeah, and when things collapsed, they almost always blamed treachery or cowardice among the rank and file rather than their own blunders. I said it earlier, and it applies here again. Some say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But you know what? This could apply to stupidity as well. Hemmed in by their own arrogance and refusal to modernize, in essence, the Spanish generals repeated hopeless charges and disorganized deployments again and again. Only rarely, as at Balan in 1808, did they achieve real success, and even that was squandered when later campaigns fell apart. Believing that sheer willpower and patriotic speeches could substitute for logistics and planning, they led armies to destruction, while guerrilla bands, not regular commanders, emerged as a true resistance. The irony was, though, that these generals were themselves often quicker to flee than to stand. At Ocaña, whole divisions collapsed while officers rode for safety. At Albuera, Spanish units broke in panic before rallying under Allied pressure. Their failures were so spectacular that Britain and Portugal increasingly took over the burden of the war. Finally, by the last campaigns of 1813, the Spanish armies were sidelined, useful mainly for numbers rather than leadership, much to the relief of their coalition partners. These generals fought like it was the 1700s and lost it like it was inevitable. Finally, the royal who poked the bear and got mauled. Alexander I was the eldest son of Tsar Paul I, who ruled the vast Russian Empire for just over 4 years before he was assassinated in 1801. Now, during his father's reign, Alexander had been educated in Enlightenment philosophy under the guidance of Swiss tutor Frédéric César de la Harpe, and while there, he developed a fascination for reformist ideals and for Europe's balance of power. By the time of his accession, he admired Napoleon Bonaparte as both a fellow modernizer and a rival whose empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube at its height. When Alexander assumed power in 1801, he tried his best to imitate his Western counterparts. At the time of his accession, Russia was the largest state in Europe, but faced serious weaknesses: a sprawling territory that was difficult to defend, a backward economy dependent on serfdom, and an officer corps dominated by noble privilege. Wanting to secure his position as Europe's arbiter and to establish Russia as a decisive continental power, he threw himself into coalition building. The idea was to form alliances that could restrain Napoleon's ambitions and elevate Russia as the leader of a united Europe. Obviously, Napoleon wasn't too happy with this, so he struck first, defeating Austrians and Russians alike at Austerlitz in December 1805. In response, Alexander insisted on fighting, even when his generals urged caution. The thing is, though, his army at Austerlitz was poorly coordinated, stretched across foggy fields, and vulnerable to Napoleon's central thrust. When the French emperor exploited the gap at the Pratzen Heights, Alexander, who had pressed for the battle against advice, presided over one of Russia's worst military humiliations. Then, to make matters even worse, successive campaigns in 1807 at Eylau and Friedland ended in bloody stalemates and defeat, forcing Alexander into the uneasy Treaty of Tilsit. Through a combination of pride, naivete, and sheer stubbornness, Alexander had committed his country into wars it was not prepared to win. In 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen, Alexander finally found himself in the position of defender rather than aggressor. Within a month, the French had crossed the Niemen and occupied Smolensk, and Russian armies retreated deeper into their homeland. In other words, within a month, the Tsar had already lost vast stretches of territory. Because he had no other choice but to adopt a defensive strategy, the burning of Moscow in September 1812 would set the tone for the rest of the campaign. Against all logic of prestige, Alexander refused to negotiate, even as his ancient capital went up in flames. Over the course of a single winter, Napoleon's Grande Armée disintegrated in the snow, harried by Russian troops and starvation, and hundreds of thousands lay dead along the frozen roads. By 1814, Alexander's armies had entered Paris itself, and the Tsar could claim victory. Increasingly triumphant but also convinced of his divine mission, he pushed for conservative order in Europe and executed those who questioned his authority. His victims included liberal reformers, dissident nobles, and Polish nationalists, all suppressed in the name of Holy Alliance. This leads us to a conclusion that defies belief. Although Russia survived the Napoleonic invasion, Alexander's hubris and poor judgment prolonged the wars for years, costing his empire hundreds of thousands of lives. This makes him, despite his triumph, one of the greatest fools of the Napoleonic Wars, and all because one overconfident emperor thought he could play chess with cannons. There is no other word for it. This Tsar, and indeed all the others on this list, were total idiots. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.